Luncheon, and I'm the Assistant Director of Community Service and the Office of Student Engagement and Multicultural Affairs at Ithaca College. I have the pleasure and honor of sitting on the planning committee for this event as well. We're glad to see everybody here today, and I also get the honor of introducing our next presenter. Our next presenter has dedicated more than 2 decades of her life as a human rights activist in her home country of Sri Lanka, a country that has been at civil war for more than 30 years, a place that is considered by many to be the most dangerous in the world for journalists to speak their minds. As a lawyer and as a multi-award-winning professional journalist, she has contributed regularly to 2 Sri Lankan newspapers, the Morning Leader and the Sunday Leader, regularly exposing a range of issues from government corruption to injustices perpetrated against women in that country. A champion of independent media, our guest uses the written word to speak truth to power. This devotion has not come without consequence. It has resulted in the suppression of her work and exile from her homeland. As the 5th participant in the City of Asylum Writer-in-Residence program, our guest remains a bold pursuant of truth and justice. She is an inspiration to anyone who believes that, in the spirit of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in order to see justice prevail everywhere, we must stand up to injustice anywhere. Fellow community members, please join me in a warm and gracious welcome to our guest, Sonali Samarasinghe. Folks, Sonali has a really wonderful, beautiful voice that is a little quieter than mine, so please remember to keep the noise down. Thank you.
Thank you. I am really deeply honored to be a part of these celebrations in remembering one of the greatest spiritual leaders of all time, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I am blessed to be here as you inaugurate for a 2nd term your first Black president. It's a beautiful day in history. Thank you, Don Austin, for that generous introduction. Thank you also to the Greater Ithaca Activities Center, to the Office of Student Engagement and Multicultural Affairs, the Center for Transformative Action, Ithaca College, Cornell University, and all the other organizers of this event. It is significant that I, a South Asian, a Sri Lankan, stand here today with you to honor the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King. My presence here is a testament to the inspiration his life has been, not only to Americans, but to the entire world. 4 years ago today, in January 2009, I fled my country. That morning, I had no time to pack suitcases. I was in hiding and running for my life. I left my country with a small hand luggage, but I have a deep love of books. So that morning, as I packed my tiny bag, in which I had hardly any room left, and picked out 4 small volumes to take with me on this journey into the unknown. A few months after I fled Sri Lanka, I was in New York City, and amidst that glorious feeling of relief and freedom and safety and the hope of new beginnings, I sat down to an early dinner at Ruby Foods restaurant in Times Square. With me I had a book. While waiting for my order, I opened this book gingerly, for its pages were yellowed with age and my fingers trembled, lest I handled it too harshly and the pages crumbled. On the inner page was my father's bold scrawl of a signature. As I started to read, a woman sitting at another table came up to me. Her curiosity had got the better of her. She apologetically excused herself and asked me what it was I was reading and why I was handling this book so carefully. "Is it some sort of ancient manuscript?" she asked, pointing to the yellowed appearance and the frayed edges of the pages. "This book means a great deal to me," I explained. "It belonged to my father. It is about a man my father taught me to revere, and it is about a life that has inspired me in my work and in my dreaming. This book, titled What Manner of Man, written by scholar and author Leron Bennett Jr., was the biography of Martin Luther King. And it was one of the 4 books I had brought with me as I fled my country. Sri Lanka is where I come from. It is a resplendent island in South Asia, endowed with natural beauty and resources beyond measure. From the 1500s, Sri Lanka was invaded and colonized, first by the Portuguese, then by the Dutch, and finally by the British. Sri Lanka is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country made up of a majority of about 72% Sinhalese, 12% Tamil, about 8% Muslims, the rest being Burghers and Malays. Sinhalese are mostly Buddhist, the Tamils are mostly Hindu, and we have about 8% Christians in the country. I am a Sinhalese, and thus I was heir to all the privileges of a majority community. After independence in 1948, the country was marred by race riots, communal violence, and finally, a brutal ethnic war as militant Tamil groups fought for a separate state. This war was fought for 27 years, ending in May 2009. The last years of the war were particularly brutal. International agencies and journalists were denied access to the war zones. The government used scorched earth policies and indiscriminate aerial bombardment. The Sri Lankan government was determined to wage a war without witness. A free press was not encouraged. 19 journalists have been killed in Sri Lanka since 1992. It was in this backdrop that I was a journalist, editor, and lawyer in Sri Lanka. My husband was the editor of one of the 2 newspapers I worked for. I was the editor of the other. As journalists, we were critics of state-sponsored violence and spoke out for human rights. Week after week, we exposed corruption in government and in military procurements. We spoke out against the colossal loss of innocent life, the vilification of journalists, activists, and human rights defenders, and the abduction and murder of anyone who dared to voice dissent. For this, we were repeatedly threatened. Our newspaper offices had several times been burnt down over a period of years, but we got back up, swept away the ashes, and continued to write and publish. Over the years, our newspapers had become a bastion for free speech, and for our audacity, we were now punished. On the morning of January 8, 2009, my husband's car was surrounded by 8 assassins on motorcycles, and he was bludgeoned to death. He was on his way to work. It was only by a bizarre twist of fate that I hadn't been with him in the car that morning, having had to attend to a worker at home who had suddenly taken ill. 2 weeks after my husband's assassination, I fled Sri Lanka due to threats to my own life. It was impossible to go on. The impunity with which the government was acting was unprecedented. There was no rule of law, and I fled with this book. So why this book, tattered and falling apart as it is? Why not get a new copy from Amazon.com? As I said, I grew up in a country marred by violence, race riots, and war. One day, when I was about 13 years old, race riots broke out yet again. Compelled to stay indoors due to an island-wide state-imposed curfew and told to stay away from the telephone by my parents, I grumbled to my father, as teenagers sometimes do, that I was bored out of my wits and had a good mind to jump curfew and go to a friend's house. My father, a man of discipline and a senior superintendent of police, immediately went to his bookshelf, filled with law books and military books and books on guerrilla warfare, and he picked out this one, Biography of Martin Luther King. Read it, he told me, and then let's talk about it. 9,000 miles away from the Lincoln Memorial in Colombo, Sri Lanka, I read the words, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I was transfixed. Some years later, my father introduced me to a wonderful movement called Initiatives of Change that based itself on the Gandhian concepts of nonviolence and absolute truth. A movement led in India by Mahatma Gandhi's grandson, Rajmohan Gandhi. Through the teaching of Gandhi and King, and by their own example, my parents taught me early that above all, we have a responsibility to right the wrongs we see before us. As a senior police officer, my father wielded considerable power. In the late 70s, he was in charge of a large district in central Sri Lanka, where Tamil Sinhala ethnic riots had just broken out yet again. The rioters, incensed by hatred, had threatened to kill my father and his family too if he tried to stop the mayhem. My father first declared a district-wide curfew, then he bundled my mom and his 3 youngest children, including myself, into the police car, and he drove around his district not only to make sure that there would be no more incidents of violence, but also to help those who were injured. He visited every single home or business premises belonging to Tamils that had been attacked or burnt down by Sinhala mobs. While traveling, we came across the injured, often beaten to within an inch of their lives, lying on the side of the road. My father would stop, radio for assistance, and stay with them till the ambulance arrived. He was strict and unrelenting with the rioters and compassionate with those who were victimized. Because my father was on the streets himself, supervising his men, it turned out his district had one of the lowest casualty figures. My father led by example. As a police officer during a violent time in our history, my dad faced many challenges, but he refused to compromise his principles or blindly follow orders if they were against his conscience. For this, he suffered greatly in his work, often not given the promotions he deserved. You may perhaps understand now why this book, tattered and falling apart as it is so imbued with so much power and significance. The book's author, Leron Bennett Jr. and Dr. King had been schoolmates and graduates at Morehouse College. The book opens with this wonderful meeting in India between that great teacher of nonviolence revered in South Asia and around the world, Mahatma Gandhi, and a group of African American pilgrims, the year 1929. At this meeting in 1929, Mahatma Gandhi sent a message to the black people of America. Let not the 12 million African Americans be ashamed of the fact that they are the grandchildren of slaves. There is no dishonor in being slaves. There is dishonor in being slave owners. But let us not think of honor or dishonor in connection with the past. Let us realize that the future is with those who would be truthful, pure, and loving. For as the old wise men have said, truth ever is, untruth never was. Love alone binds the truth, and love accrues only to the truly humble. Mahatma Gandhi said, perhaps it will be through the African American that the unadulterated message of nonviolence will be delivered to the world. Dr. King was then 6 years old. Years later, Martin Luther King Jr. would fulfill Gandhi's prophecy. Gandhi's method was to return good for evil, to work for ultimate reconciliation even with your worst opponent, and to openly break unjust laws and be willing to pay the penalty. Rivers of blood, Gandhi said, may have to flow before we gain our freedom, but it must be our blood. Dr. King had come to see early that the Gandhian message of nonviolence was one of the most potent weapons in the struggle for freedom. He was to later write that nonviolent resistance was not a method for cowards. That is what Dr. King taught us. Surely it was a method which my husband believed in too. When people asked my husband why he took such risks and warned him that it was only a matter of time before he would be killed, He would smile and say, "It comes with the territory. I know it is inevitable. But if we do not speak out now, there will be no one left to speak for those who cannot, whether they be ethnic minorities, the disadvantaged, or the persecuted." My husband knew that one day he will have to pay the price. He always said he was ready for that. He did nothing to prevent that outcome. No security, no precautions. He wanted his murderers to know that he was not a coward, hiding behind human shields while condemning thousands of innocent people to their deaths. Yes, nonviolence is not for the coward. But even as we celebrate Dr. King, there are still some 21 million people in forced labor or sexual exploitation around the world. About 3 people in every 1,000 are not yet free. These are only the documented. It is estimated there are millions who are not even a statistic. There are 15.4 million refugees in the world today. Last year, 119 journalists were killed around the world. Every time some tragedy takes place, the good among us stand up and say, "No, never again, enough is enough." And yet it happens over and over and over again with demonic repetition. Since the Nuremberg trials in 1946, there have been an estimated 80 to 100 million deaths due to war crimes or crimes against humanity. For many, the dream is still to realize. For millions, freedom has yet to come. For thousands, help already came too late. This is not a fight we can fight alone as South Asians or journalists or Buddhists or Hindus or blacks or whites. It is a fight we must fight together as a global community. Because every time a little girl goes to school in Pakistan, each time a child is freed from slavery in a shrimp farm in Bangladesh, every time there is one less stare, one less insensitive remark, one less snub that makes the life of the minority, the other disenfranchised, a little less harsh. Each time that happens, Dr. King's dream prevails. Just another reason that now is the time to act. Thank you.
That was an amazing talk. Thank you so much, Sonali. Thank you very much for sharing that story and for sharing with us on today.